They love it when I turn up the bass.
Do you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no.
Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. That the government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
Hello, and it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu.
Now, Byline TV has no big Murdoch moguls behind it. It has no hedge funds based in Dubai, nor any big advertisers. So we are reliant on you. You are our mini Murdochs. You look after us, you fund us, and if you join us and support us on Patreon, you can talk to us privately after this public show, telling you all the things we can't say in public. And we've got a busy show coming up. We're going to be looking at real threats to press freedom in the UK and creakiness and dangers over press freedom and indeed peace in Northern Ireland. But it's Friday night with Byline Times because Friday night is the night we finish our digital front page, isn't it, Hardeep?
It is.
Hardeep usually tells me what to do and I put it up. But tonight I chose the headline, and the headline is...
The anti-woke war.
The anti-woke wars, that's right. So this is called the anti-woke wars, this edition. Why? Because Hardeep has the lead article. She bribed me a lot to make it the headline, didn't you, Hardeep?
It's all lies. These are all lies.
If only they were true, we could earn some money. Hardeep, tell me about what is in your lead article.
Yes, so we're talking about the anti-woke wars. So woke is a term that sort of exploded. It was originally a reference to people who were awake to social and racial injustice and were fighting to level the playing field and reduce inequalities. But it's basically been co-opted now. So it's now used, definitely in America and certainly by the Boris Johnson government, as a way of calling, academics, activists, journalists, anyone fighting the good fight, as it were, denouncing them as lefty, sort of unpatriotic, metropolitan, liberal, and we can see most sort of prominently that this has now been sort of used with regards to history and British history and the weaponisation of it. So this week I spoke to Professor Corinne Fowler of Leicester University. Last year she was one of the co-editors of a National Trust report which came out detailing how many of the buildings in its care had links to slavery and colonialism. There was a big backlash after the report. And ever since, to be honest, she's been the victim of constant sort of articles in the right-wing media, sort of picking on all of her work and again denouncing her as on this sort of woke agenda, which is sort of threatening and trying to rewrite history. And she's more concerningly even than that. I mean, she's had to report 3 incidents of threats to the police. And really, she was speaking out about this climate that is really being ramped up now around sort of attacks on sort of people in public life. And really what we're seeing, Peter, I think, as Brexit reality kind of really comes to us now and we see the effects of it, the divisions which were created in Brexit, it's a central plank of the Brexit project, they're now being carried forward in this sort of anti-woke agenda which is weaponising history. And so, it's covering all sorts of areas, and we've just had this week another announcement that the government will be doing a review into extreme left-wing activism and that sort of thing. So really this whole environment is sort of now there to deflect and to divide, I think.
Well, the second story we had by Nafeez Ahmed, if you can see on the front page, so picks this up in big time because Sir Robbie Gibb, former BBC producer for Andrew Neil at Sunday Politics, I think it was, then became Theresa May's press advisor, was an early front man for GB News. Apparently now discovered is no longer involved, but at the same time, he was working with some colleagues with the Home Office on their agenda, and they have this agenda about anti-extremism in Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion. So you're seeing a media war, like you say, the Mail is conducting, but the worrying new development, we're used to that, is them employing the Home Office, employing law. We'll be talking soon to a photographer who will be able to explain more about this, but just on that, we call it the culture wars. We see Steve Bannon's influence, anti-wokeism. I mean, they're trying to divide and rule and also distract, isn't it? Because Brexit isn't going well, as we've covered extensively. The coronavirus response of Boris Johnson is one of the worst in the world. So what do, apart from photographing their dog, is divide and rule us, don't they? You quote a line, I said, I love it when people quote me. When you can't rely on truth, you hide a myth, don't you? You fight the myth. And there's a certain element they're trying to distract us, don't you think?
I mean, this whole element to do with the weaponisation of British history, the empire, and these accusations that journalists and historians and activists who are just trying to set the historical record straight are in some way unpatriotic and rewriting history. I mean, that is really, really concerning, Peter. And of course, it's all in myth. It's all about the myths as a country we've told ourselves. And the question is where it's going to lead when it's being weaponised in this way against people.
Well, the problem with myth is very difficult to fight, and it's very emotional, isn't it? And people identify with the flag or the cenotaph, but it is also very, very difficult to fight. And so I think our ground is we try to pursue the truth, things which are not mythical, like coronavirus failures, like failures for fishing merchants and the Brexit deal. Meanwhile, trying to explain there are genuine histories here. And we must say, this ends in death threats, or at least threats of violence. We've seen this not only against historians, we've seen this against judges, enemies of the people. We've seen it against lawyers, activist lawyers. And as we'll see in the moment, we see it a lot against journalists. But before we and I've noticed online, particularly during the coronavirus crisis, now against health workers, against doctors. And for some reason, Hardeep, is it my imagination, it's particularly against women.
It is against women. That's Professor Corinne Fowler, who I interviewed for the main story in our front page. That's exactly what she highlighted. And she said it's really concerning that there is so much hatred directed against women in public life. And something that really struck with me was she was saying, well, I'm not intimidated, I'm not going anywhere. But that's not for everyone. You shouldn't have to be very resilient to be a woman in public life. And her bigger concern was that what this is all really part of is rolling back progressive wins. So if you make the environment hostile enough for people of colour, for women, for people with LGBT rights, if you create an environment in which you have to be very resilient to survive, that those people will just be put off. I
couldn't agree more. And Hardeep, as a journalist who spent sort of 6 or 7 years now in this domain with tabloid journalists attacking me, they're there to deter you. They're there to shut you up. And you can get thick-skinned and you can withstand the threats, and for me, not as physical as they are towards women, to investigate, to ruin your reputation. But it's unpleasant, and why should you? And it's so funny because it's coming from exactly that right-wing group, because they all surround the free speeches. If you go into a Peter Hitchens thread, or you go to one of these threads of these free speech people, you get abused. They are trying, it's censorship, it's just censorship. We won't give in, of course, won't we? Will we? And more importantly, you, our audience, should support other journalists and people who don't give in to these threats. Now, there is a massive threat to journalism at the moment in the UK. Byline Times recently signed a letter with all major editors, including some from like the Mail you might not approve of, about the government restricting Freedom of Information Act. We have a short report coming up with Rebecca Vincent from the Reporters Without Frontiers Foundation. Exactly what are the threats to journalists now in an increasingly hostile environment for telling the truth? And let's look at the history of Anna Politkovskaya in Russia, women in Slovenia, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. Women journalists are also at the front line of this war against truth.
Each year, RSF publishes the World Press Freedom Index. It gives a comprehensive look at 180 countries in terms of their performance on press freedom. Some people might be surprised to know that the UK is ranked 35th out of 180 countries. Many would assume or hope that we would be doing better, and indeed we should be doing better. But the UK is an example of one of the democracies that has been sliding in terms of performance in recent years. So this year, on publication of the 2020 index, we highlighted a few trends as being of utmost concern during the year. One is the case of Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks publisher who is currently facing an extradition hearing, will possibly be sent to the US to face 18 counts under the Espionage Act and other charges in connection with his publication of leaked information. Another issue is safety of journalists in Northern Ireland. Last year, we saw the tragic killing of young freelancer Lyra McKee whilst observing rioting in the Craig area of Derry. But it wasn't just Lyra's killing, it was also the fact that journalists that continue to cover paramilitaries and organised crime remain at great risk in Northern Ireland. And this is all against a broader backdrop of problematic legislation for years. Oftentimes, legislation passed in areas related to surveillance, privacy rights, data protection, or national security have an adverse impact on the ability of journalists to do their job.
And now we're going to be speaking to Andy Aitchison. He's a photojournalist of nearly 30 years. But about a week and a half ago, he was arrested after taking some photos of a protest that was happening outside some barracks housing asylum seekers. He was in no way involved in the protest. He was merely just doing his job. And yet he found himself facing charges. Let's talk to Andy. Hi, Andy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Can you take us through what happened on that day? How did you end up being arrested for merely doing your job?
Well, I'd received a tip-off the night before that something might be happening up at the barracks about 8 a.m. Through a social media channel, and I went up to the barracks about 7:45, stood around, not a lot going on, and then I looked across and I saw 6 people dressed in boiler suits, wearing face masks, walking towards me and the barracks, carrying black buckets. They proceeded to come round to the front gate. I sort of followed them round and stood in the road, and 2 people unveiled big banners that said, Priti Patel, you're going to have blood on your hands, and close Napier Barracks now. And then 2 people came from either side, and they were throwing buckets of red liquid that looked like blood over the banners, over the gate, and also over the people holding the banners.
Gosh, and then what happened? I mean, you took some photos and the police turned up?
No, I took some photos. They ran off. The security guards came to the back of the gate and started filming out what was going on. I stopped taking pictures. I started walking down the street to go back to my car to go back to the office. As I was walking down the street, they started running, the security guards, trying to chase the other people. I got into my car and I drove home. And I was home about 20 past 8 that day. I then worked on the pictures, edited the pictures, captioned them, and I sent them in to my agent about 9:30. And then about midday, I think, one of the local newspapers put them up online, and a few people started tagging Priti Patel in the tweets. And then about 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in my office working on my computer, and my children came into the room saying there's 5 police officers coming to our front door.
Gosh.
We could see them walking up across the garden, and they pulled up in a big police riot type van out the front of the house, and 5 or 6 of them had come to the door. They knocked on the door and I spoke to them through the glass because I could see them quite well, and they said they needed to come in. I said, well, can I help you from here? And they said, no, we need to come in, and showed me a piece of paper that said they had a search warrant. So I opened the door and they came in, and they said that they were arresting me on charges of criminal damage. And they said they needed to search the property.
And what was their justification for you having apparently committed criminal damage by taking some photos?
There was no justification for it at all. They said, we need to search your property. I said, but I'm a journalist. You know, he showed them my NUJ press card. I said, I've been working today. This is my press card. They said, doesn't matter. We need to search your house. So I said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, are you looking for the pictures that I took today? So I said, they said, yes. So I just went and got my memory card out of my camera. I gave that to them. The police officer followed me into my office, and then he also picked up my mobile phone from my desk and said they needed that as well. And then they took me down to the station.
Did they charge you at all, Andy? Or just they cautioned you? What's the next process?
No, they arrested me. They took my DNA. They fingerprinted me. They photographed me. They kept me locked up till about 10 p.m. And in that time, they interviewed me to ask me what I was doing there. And I'd made a statement through my solicitor at the time saying that I was there working. Photography is my job. I'm a journalist. I have a press card. You know, I was there working. And then they released me that evening. And then a week later, I got a call from a police officer who'd interviewed me, and she said that they were dropping the charges and bail had been lifted. But they put a bail condition on me that I wasn't allowed to go to Napier Barracks.
Extraordinary. I mean, my understanding, maybe I got this wrong, and you know, a solicitor would advise you would have had some sort of journalistic exemption, you know, a production order to take your. But there's this ever happened to you before, Andy, in what is it, 27 years as a photographer?
I've never been arrested for anything in my life. No, so no, it's not happened to me before. And you know, you go on protests. You know, I photographed many demonstrations, many actions, and there's been police around, but you're there working. You're not there participating. And you know, there's a very clear line, I think. You know, and you know, I think having my press card on me and showing it to them, and them, and you know, even like standing in my kitchen, and them still saying we're arresting you for criminal damage. You know, I couldn't really believe it. It just seemed, I said, well, just look at the pictures. It's really obvious that I wasn't committing any damage at all.
How could you take pictures and throw blood or fake blood? It's just inconceivable.
And what do
you can't. And
sorry, Andy, I was just about to ask. I mean, you fear that, I mean, this was a completely politicised sort of attack on you, just doing your job?
It felt like the police had been told to come and pick me up and question me about what went on. It felt that the powers above the police that arrested me came to pick me up, and they got my details from seeing my my byline on my picture. But you know, the Napier Barracks is a very sensitive subject at the moment. There's been a lot of things happening in there. You know, people are living in very, very bad conditions in there. A lot of charities and organisations aren't working in there anymore because they're asking everyone who goes in there to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So any charities that would do work with asylum seekers aren't going in because they're not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement.
Was it Napier? I think there's another asylum seekers hostel where we were put on Byline Times where the allowance for food was £8 a week or something. And my fear is that we've seen a lot of Priti Patel saying she's anti-Black Lives Matter today and saying, you know, wouldn't take the knee, but the whole thing about extremists, left-wing extremists penetrating. There seems not only a stamping down the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly at the same time, the rights to assembly, the rights to protest.
Especially during, you know, COVID times, you know, they're hammering down on that. But you know, as you know, journalists are classed as key workers for travelling around during those times. So you know, it's very important that journalists are allowed to continue their work because someone needs to be there to witness things going on and be able to tell people about it.
And just lastly, I mean, Andy, the work that you do is in settings like prisons. I mean, you take some fantastic photographs of, you know, English jails, which we published on Byline Times. You really lift the lid on, you know, out of sight, out of mind environments. If you had got a criminal record over this incident, I mean, that would have really affected the work you could do going forward. I mean, talking about your livelihood, essentially, that the government, you know, the government perhaps was trying to ruin.
Yes, I think, you know, if I had been charged with, I mean, they couldn't have charged me with criminal damage because I didn't do any criminal damage. But if I had been charged, then yes, it would have a massive impact on my work in prisons. And I'm slightly fearful that it still will have an impact on it. You know, I do a lot of work there's a lot of great charitable organisations that work in prisons, and I go in with quite a lot of those to photograph the good work that they do with prisoners in there. And it would have a big impact on my future earnings and my career.
Well, fingers crossed that that's not the case. But Andy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really glad the charges have been dropped, and keep going.
Me too. Will do. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Well, that was shocking, isn't it? I mean, we are seeing assaults on journalism deep. We're seeing a lot of them. But we'll keep on document them. We won't let them get away with it. But there does seem to mood under Boris Johnson's government. A lot of pattern of activity with Priti Patel's Home Office. In fact, I think we just published a piece today. How did you see that Faculty AI, who were the Vote Leave data analysts, are doing some law enforcement contract for the Home Office? So we'll keep an eye on all these potential threats to our freedom of expression and our freedom of assembly. And a lot of this in the context of Brexit. And one of the places we've been following a lot of things that have happened with, in the last 2 months, particularly 1.5 months, disappointed Brexiteers. What happens with the fishing industry if you're exporting cheese, when you actually hit those non-tariff barriers about compliance, about the food or the paperwork, the tax regime. And so last weekend, our team went to Northern Ireland to find out what is happening there with the former Brexiteers and what they feel about the reality ever since we actually left the EU under the LTA. Now, just a word of warning here, the team went to where there were extreme Brexiteers. And so that means they were mainly filming in loyalist parts of Belfast. And that's because there's a tendency for unionists, not completely exceptional, to be more pro-Brexit and others not to be. But Northern Ireland as a whole was very pro-Remain. We previously have spoken to unionists who were Remainers. So let's watch this excerpt, quite a chilling and worrying excerpt, from those Brexiteers who are very keen on Britain leaving the EU and what they feel now.
I voted leave myself, and if someone were to ask me whether I vote leave again, I'm not sure, is the honest answer.
Well, we were lied to over Brexit. We should have been told what Brexit was going to look like and then vote for it. Then that would have been sensible. You would have known what you were voting for. We weren't voting for this.
There's people within our community feel like we've been pawns in all this.
He's a traitor. He's sold out the people of Northern Ireland. He's betrayed the Union. The Union that many people all across the United Kingdom fought and died for, and Boris Johnson has partitioned the Union. So he's he's a traitor.
I think in Northern Ireland there is very little credibility left for him.
Me personally, I can't speak for anybody else, but the guy's a clampet. The guy's a buffoon.
Boris Johnson, our own Prime Minister, came to this country and promised unionists in particular within this country that he would never allow a customs border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. To use his words, he said it would happen over his dead body. And now look at us. There's a feeling of betrayal.
The people, they're all angry. We can't get stuff in, and I go out to the shops and there's barely anything there.
He continues to maintain that there's no impediments to trade, that there is no customs border, that Northern Ireland will still be a full part of the UK, and everyone can see that that's not the case. It's almost a Trumpian tactic.
There's a lot of people obviously not happy with it and the complications it's causing.
Well, let's hope it doesn't go back to the olden days that we had, kind of way we had a lot of borders all in and around, kind of way, coming from down south as well as Northern Ireland. I think the people in Northern Ireland in general don't want any borders.
The United Kingdom is meant to be united. What this Prime Minister has done through this customs arrangement is divided it.
What will happen in the future, I wouldn't like to say. I wouldn't like to say.
So to talk about some of the issues raised in that film and what's going on in Northern Ireland, I'm welcome to join here, happy to be joined here by Mike Buckley, who is a journalist for Byron Times. He writes regularly for Byron Times, but also director of Labour for European Future. So you're a bit of a Remainer. No, you were. Now, Mike spent quite a time in Northern Ireland, knows the issues very well last year. Mike, we haven't spoken properly since the LTA has been agreed, since we have technically Brexited. What do you think's been going on in the province of Northern Ireland?
Well, so the people I met last year were involved in a whole range of different sectors. So I met an academic, I met somebody who runs the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium, who deals with obviously trade, shipping, supermarkets, so they're going to get stock, all of that. Somebody who works in human rights, some politicians. And I mean, it was a fascinating time. This was last March, so just as we were kind of heading into the first lockdown, and speaking to them about, where we were then, with the deal still unagreed. At that point, great levels of concern about whether a deal would be agreed or not, but also concerns about just the new reality, even if a deal was agreed. And of course, it has been agreed. And indeed, with the original Northern Ireland Protocol, which at that point had been agreed because that was done under the withdrawal agreement the year before.
Just to explain to people, under the because the UK had decided to leave a customs union, you need therefore border checks. It couldn't be along the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland because the Good Friday Agreement, signed in 1997-98, sort of forbade that. And so Johnson's solution was to put a border in the Irish Sea and keep Northern Ireland for trade and customs reasons in a market, in the customs union with the Republic. Is that right? Have I explained
exactly.
that right?
So essentially what's happened is that Johnson and Gove have made their own mistakes, their own errors, but they're trying to blame the European Union, understandably, because that's what they always do. So obviously Brexit means the way that they've chosen to do it means that we've all left, like the whole United Kingdom has left the single market, customs union and the European Union, which is the whole shebang.
Which is a hard Brexit. Let's be honest, that is what's deemed a hard Brexit, because you could have stayed in the single market, you could have stayed in the customs union.
Well, exactly. I mean, in 2016, a lot of Leavers were saying, we don't like the political bit, we like the economic, we want to be in the common market, single market customs union, we want to leave the politics. And of course, that gradually shifted over 4 years to, the hardest Brexit possible, leaving absolutely everything, which for all of us means greater economic impact, makes us all poorer. But for Northern Ireland, it's particularly problematic. So Theresa May had decided that we would all stay in the customs union to enable trade to continue between all parts of the UK, as in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and also with the European Union as well, it was itself a hard Brexit, but softer than the one that we got. Boris Johnson decided that we would, I think, be the only country in the world that would put a customs border, a trade border within its own territory. Nobody else has been mad enough to do this. So of course it was going to lead to problems. So Johnson and Gove now saying these problems were unforeseen and it's the European Union's fault, they knew exactly what they were signing up for.
And you've been warning about this for a year.
It's the people in Northern Ireland, exactly, it's the people in Northern Ireland who are losing out most, partly economically, but also the biggest concern is for the peace process, because nobody knows what the repercussions are going to be. The Good Friday Agreement was glorious in its simplicity in a way, because it allowed people living in Northern Ireland to choose to be identified as British or Irish, and there was no problem with that at all, because we were all within the European Union. But it was created on the premise that Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK would stay in the European Union. So now suddenly all of that is destabilised, and understandably people in Northern Ireland are worried for what that means for the future, because nobody wants to go back to the way that things were.
Well, I'm old enough to remember 30 years of effectively a dirty war. 3,000 people died. I mean, that, by the time it ended, is more than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's one of the longest, dirtiest wars post-war in Europe, obviously separating places like Bosnia. So you're saying that basically this forces a choice of identities back between a British identity and Irish identity, rather than the overarching European identity. It's true, isn't it? Quite a lot of Northern Ireland Protestants or Loyalists or Unionists have chosen to get an Irish passport because that allows them to have access to the European Union, doesn't it, and travel. Is that not solving things? There's not a sense of convergence around. Ireland has also offered the Republic to pay the Erasmus scheme for people in Northern Ireland. Is that causing friction, or is that sort of leading to some kind of sense of unity?
I mean, I think there'll be different responses among different sections of the community. So from what I understand, I think younger people feel less tied to one identity or another, and for them it is more pragmatic. And I think a lot of particularly younger unionists have taken Irish passports because, of course, it gives them the right to live, work, travel, love, marry, retire, in 26 or 27 other countries. So why wouldn't you do that?
No-brainer.
Well, exactly. It genuinely is a no-brainer. But I think there will be older unionists who feel much more tied to the British identity and tied to the past in a way. And it's not for us to belittle that in any, by any means.
And they're the ones who feel betrayed because suddenly there is a border between them and Scotland, for example. We had I think it was a cheese producer who could no longer export to Northern Ireland.
And they were promised something very different from that. I mean, Boris Johnson very clearly said, it would be over his dead body, for a border to be put down the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Of course, he went ahead and did it. And I genuinely feel sorry for anybody who trusts a word that comes out of Boris Johnson's mouth. Sadly, people do, and they've been let down. But for the whole province, and indeed for the Republic of Ireland as well, there is the danger that this results in renewed violence and renewed conflict.
I mean, is this coming out of economic... We've talked about the identities, and you could have an overlapping identity. You could be Irish, British, you could be Irish, European, British. You could choose these multiple identities under the European Union and the Good Friday Agreement. Is there, beyond the identity issue and sort of flag waving, have you heard of any economic impacts? We had a bit of a debate that some people said there were shelves empty in some parts of town, other people said that's ridiculous. And we've got to be careful not to scaremonger. But we certainly see economic impacts in England and Scotland. So I'm just wondering if you've heard of any economic impacts already.
Well, there definitely have been. I mean, one of the saddest things about Brexit is it's people at the bottom of the pile who are going to lose out most. And I mean, Philip Hammond, former Chancellor under Theresa May, said this week that he was saddened by the fact that it's the people in the north, particularly, who were poorer, voted for Brexit, voted for Boris Johnson, voted Conservative for the first time. They're the communities that are going to lose out most. And of course, we know that most Brexit voters were, wealthy people in the home counties. But actually, there's a chunk of them who were in the north and voted because they believed 350 million for the NHS and they believed that public services would improve. Where, of course, the exact opposite in the case. Now, the voters in Leafy Surrey will, broadly speaking, be fine. A bit poorer, but they'll live to tell the tale. But it's voters in these poorer communities going to lose out most. But that, of course, impacts on Northern Ireland because Northern Ireland was already the poorest part of the UK. Their disposable income is a fraction of what disposable income is in England, Scotland and Wales, because no government really has made the efforts to improve lives over there, improve economic circumstances. So they're already on a low rung, and they've been thrown off that rung. And then there are trade disparities as well now, so it's now much harder, for example, for supermarkets and stores like Marks and Spencer and John Lewis. There are certain products they won't send anymore because it's too expensive and just not worth their while.
Because they're basically sending it over a border. If you had Marks and Spencer in Belfast.
It's like exporting into the European Union now, which is, of course, very problematic, as we know. So supply chains will over time move. Yeah. And in the end, supermarkets and other shops will import more via the Republic than from Great Britain. Of course, that then keys into the identity side of things, because then unionists are afraid that as the economic drags them closer to the Republic, that makes United Ireland more likely. And while essentially in identity terms there was a truce for 30 odd years with the Good Friday Agreement, but that truce, it hasn't been lifted yet, but it could be. And it just depends really how much things are destabilised. And of course the economics has something to play with that as well. Suddenly, if you're finding it harder to make ends meet, you then get angry about identity issues. And we've seen that play out in multiple different contexts across the planet, and we don't want to see that play out in Northern Ireland because, first and foremost, we have a responsibility because this is our country that we're talking about. It can often feel like it's them over there, it's the people over the water, but actually we're all part of the same country. And our government, the Westminster government has just as much responsibility for the people of Northern Ireland as it does for people in Westminster.
Putting your political hat on for a moment and your knowledge of Westminster and things like that, I think I'm right in saying that Michael Gove, back in the late 90s, thought the Good Friday Agreement was abhorrent. To what extent do you think that the provoking of these old fears, raising up these issues, these binary either or instead of this overarching identities, is just carelessness on their part and just the opportunism of Johnson and Brexit and trying to make it work without knowing how to and not expecting to win? Or do you think there is genuine desire to unravel that, given that's a very binding international treaty, isn't it? But they have said, actually over these protocols, wasn't it, that they are willing to renege on international law. How much do you think of its malice? How much is just pure carelessness on the part of the British government?
I think in October 2019, Boris Johnson was desperate to get a Brexit deal through because he wanted to force a general election and win a majority, and of course he did, as we know, to all of our costs, very sadly.
Oh, some people are happy if you're concerned.
I think that was part of it, and of course he was being pushed by the ERG, like the ultra-Brexit Conservatives, who've really had the whip hand in the Conservative Party for a long time now, to go for the hardest possible Brexit. They didn't like Theresa May's deal because it kept us tied into certain elements of European Union regulation, which they have this irrational hatred for.
We're law takers rather than lawmakers because we're no longer making the laws, we have to abide by them.
Exactly.
That's the whole argument.
Although in the end, of course, we end up having to obey EU laws anyway, otherwise the complete trade agreement would fall apart. And the level playing field, which says that we need to not deregulate away from European Union standards, is the only thing that guarantees tariff-free and quota-free trade, which of course doesn't facilitate free trade, but it's far better than nothing. So if we do remove ourselves from EU standards, they've caught us on a hook, basically, which they don't mean to do out of malice. They just care about the integrity of their economy and their single market.
Gravitational power, 27 countries
Exactly.
against one, or was it how many? 400 million against
450 million against 60 or 70 of us.
That's kind of going to win.
Had we still been a member and another country would have left, we would have wanted to do exactly the same thing. So
third-party rules. That's what we.
I mean, we created the rules of the single market largely when we were a European Union member. So what's being done to us is simply what we wrote down, back in the 80s and the 90s.
So you think there's opportunism? He had to get a deal done, so he went through with this, with the border, withdrawal agreement deal. And then it's kind of stuck with it and muttered about breaking law. So just looking ahead very briefly, I mean, it's horrible trying to be as a prophet in these things, and especially you don't want to be a prophet of gloom. But you see the forces for convergence still there, that eventually they'll have to settle this out and we'll have to abide by sort of more customs union, de facto join a customs union, and it'll settle down that way? Or do you see it sort of being fissurpus, separating?
We don't know. I mean, it's entirely possible that our government, because they keep talking about it, would invoke Article 16 of the protocol.
Just explain Article 16.
So Article 16 has, of course, become famous because of the vaccines route. And it's a standard thing that is put in agreements of this kind, but it's never intended to be used. And it says that in extreme circumstances, where life or something like that, or civil society or civil obedience or whatever, civil safety is at risk, then the requirements of the whole protocol can be put on pause, if you like. So this would enable, in the context where, say, there's major conflict taking off in Northern Ireland, then we would be able to say suspend the protocol, and we would then be able to take whatever we wanted over there.
Right, so it's kind of emergency break.
It's an emergency break.
But would that then create a hard border again?
It's not there for normal circumstances. It's not if it's only used briefly, for example, for a few days or weeks, and that's all it's intended for.
So that wouldn't undermine the Good Friday Agreement, because you wouldn't get a hard border between the Republic.
No, exactly. But what our government is talking about is using Article 16 for a purpose that it was never intended for, which is basically to get round the terms of the protocol, and basically to get round the fact that we've left Northern Ireland for all intents and purposes in the single market and the customs union, for economic purposes, so that there's a border down the Irish Sea and not across the island of Ireland. If we use Article 16 to suspend the protocol entirely and then start shipping things to Northern Ireland that we're not allowed to under the protocol, the EU will have no choice, and Ireland will have no choice, but to put a hard border in place. At that point,
a land border.
A land border. At that point, all bets are off. Now, I mean, the darkest possible view is that our government wants to force that because they want a hard border in place, but they don't want to be the ones to do it. I'm not that cynical about the motives of our government. And I think if that happens, it will be much more by accident than design.
It's a bit like the hard deal, wasn't it? We were told they were driving off the cliff to the hard deal. And this is a related fact. The victory of Biden rather than Trump in the election, I think, made some of the calculations about a trade deal with America. And related to that is the Good Friday Agreement, because Biden is of Irish heritage, and the American presidency and the Congress was very instrumental in the Good Friday Agreement, wasn't it?
It was, absolutely. Well, it wouldn't have happened without Clinton and without the Americans, and they care a great deal about Ireland, partly because, Biden himself, but actually a lot of people involved in US politics, for one reason or another, have got Irish heritage, and they carry that with them, that emotion. And they're also very aware that it was a major success. I mean, in Biden's terms, of the foreign policy of his own party. And they don't want to see it. They don't want to see it all unwound, and violence ensue again. So he will do everything that he possibly can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, we don't want to predict the future in any negative ways, but we do want to be aware. So, Mike, thank you. I mean, hopefully you'll come back and keep us posted on this and other things. Mike writes brilliantly about COVID and other issues too. Before, as we round off this interview, we have from last night a sequence with Mike Galsworthy talking to Naomi Long, which makes similar points about it being a frozen conflict for 30 years, the Good Friday Agreement, and that economic issues could reactivate that conflict.
When we're talking about Northern Ireland politically and culturally, the way I always describe it is that Northern Ireland doesn't have a resolved conflict. It is a frozen conflict. I grew up there during the height of the Troubles. I went to school there. I vividly remember bombs, bomb scares. violence on both sides and how that came to an end with the ceasefires and then the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And when you disrupt the economy, when the economy is hurt and unemployment rises, that's when tensions boil over. When young men in particular don't have access to the jobs that they did before, things can boil over and become really quite sinister. And I think everyone is just terrified of peace in Northern Ireland being threatened. So something would have to replace the protocol. To my mind, it's not obvious what would be acceptable. I think what's good is that the EU has accepted its mistakes over the triggering of Article 50 and has taken the criticism on board, the fair criticism they got for it. And I think that's a lesson to both sides as to how to get their acts together now and find a resolution for all of these border problems that Northern Ireland's facing at the moment.
That was Naomi Long talking last night on Mike Goulsworthy's show on Byline TV, which is called Science and Politics. I urge you to tune in. It's on 8 o'clock every Thursdays. And like our show, Friday Night with Byline Times, it is sponsored by you. No oligarchs, no moguls, no hedge funds funding this. Just you on Patreon, supporting our team, supporting the production costs. And if you pay a little money, you get behind the scenes and we answer all your questions with complete candor. So I'm back with Hardeep now. What did you think about the Northern Ireland? I mean, that is like the running saw, isn't it, of this? So just one line, I must say, Chris Gray wrote this wonderful article for us about sovereignty, which is in this month's print edition of Byline Times, I think, where he goes, no other country ever in the history, I think Mike made a similar point, to ensure its own sovereignty, cut itself in half, created a border within itself.
I know. I mean, it's just the complexity of the issue and the fact that the Boris Johnson government has been so, remiss about the consequences for Northern Ireland. When we know the Good Friday Agreement was so seminal for a reason. I mean, that to me is just constantly shocking. And again, the disunited kingdom, Peter, it's something we're going to keep looking at in Byline, isn't it? Constantly.
Hardeep is writing a lot about divide and rule, the echoes of empire, and we have this little theory, don't we, which Britain is, that's why, not our own theory necessarily, Barnett has the same theory, why it hated the EU, because it's its own little super state with its own countries. Obviously, we've covered what's happening in Scotland, mutterings now of a bigger independent movement in Wales. But let's cheer ourselves up a bit by looking at this month's print edition of Byline Times. Just to explain, there is a free news website, which you get to see for free. We'll never put a paywall in. But to pay the journalists and the expensive stuff we do for the print edition, you get a copy of a print copy once a month. The highlights, the best stuff, Mike Buckley's in it, of course, part of the best stuff from the top quarter 25 stories of 100 of that month, redesigned, re-edited by Hardeep, laid out. And that subsidizes the free journalism, like your Patreon subscriptions on Byline TV, subsidize all the free stuff. So we look at the front page. Have we got it up there at all? Yes. So yeah, waking from a nightmare, sleepwalking into an abyss. So we know what that's about already. It's about Biden versus Boris Johnson, and that we think there's hope in America. We said this before, and yet we're not. But what do you think of the design, Hardeep?
Oh, I love it. I absolutely think it takes Byline Times' print edition into sort of a completely new level of what we're trying to do. So I'm
the front cover, I like it because it's kind of got that superhero thing. You particularly like some of the Brexit coverage we have here now. The Fisherman's Tales and the...
well, I have to correct you on one thing, Peter, because you said it's the best articles. And so when I'm compiling a monthly print edition, it is so difficult because we have so much good work on Byline Times, spanning the whole range of, argument pieces, genuine reportage, investigations, culture. So it's not so much that this is necessarily the best, because that would be very, very unfair to many of our writers who are not in the paper.
Yes,
but actually, the print edition is a slightly different, thing from the website in that it's a monthly edition, so it's something we want people to take away, really think about, read about, and in I guess to a greater extent, is looking at the more structural issues and sort of almost those timeless stories that people can read.
Yes, a month later.
3 weeks on and that sort of thing. But I did really like the whole section we have on Brexit, which I think people at home have just seen, just purely because, again, that's such a big structural issue. But we did the whole span of, you know, Mike's piece about sort of the ugly reality, the reality of Brexit rears its ugly head. And then we looked at some practical elements about we don't know how much fish the EU's taking from our waters. We looked at the regret.
Calamari calamity, my headline.
In Falklands Islands.
Calamari
so even
calamity.
Our overseas, our territories. And then we really looked at sort of, even when it comes to, you know, trade deals that need to be made in the wake of Brexit, and how that might override human rights concerns with some countries, and also the green agenda. You know, where does leaving the EU and the sort of environmental regulations that have always come with that, where does that leave us? So again, it was just an opportunity across quite a few pages to explore the structural elements of that.
But, and then as you move on, you get into the more featurey pieces. Some guy, Peter Jukes, writes something about, I'm not sure about that guy. But we try to create a narrative, don't we? And moving into lovely design, I think, when they get to the outright, we have about Sian Norris, a writer who's become a part-time staff with us now, writing about masculinity and Trump and that guy with the headdress. It's great fun to work on. It is a brilliant thing. I think that is the issue, isn't it? That we, in the monthly, it's not a magazine. It's not like New Statesman thought. It's kind of a newspaper, then moves to a magazine, and then kind of history book, isn't it? And we have regular diary now, exclusive, to the print edition by Peter Oborn, who names some names. And of course we have the Upside Down. Jonathan Portis is now writing for us, Jonathan Liss. But I can tell you something even you don't know about Hardeep. I can tell the audience this, that coming up, we have a new series, a cartoon series like Alice in Wonderland, with Otto English, and it's illustrated by Martin Rosen. I can't tell you much, but what I can tell you is all set in Downing Street, and it's all about dead cats.
It's very quest, apt, Peter.
It's a quest to find who killed the cat, and Dylan is the hero. Dylan the dog.
That sounds very apt.
So we can have fun things on the paper doing that, but only really with your support. And next week, well, people always ask us, I will soon be going over to Patreon and answering your questions in more detail. They ask us, don't they, quite often, what will you be writing about next week? And what we always say, just don't ask us this question.
But we do have some ideas for Byline Times in the next week. We do have some ideas.
For once.
Because I think Peter and I are going to jointly write something, aren't we? We want to explore myth and reality and the dangerous gap. And we've talked about, haven't we, how everything seems the opposite. You know, we've got a Brexit where businesses are, you know, going bust overnight, but apparently it's about taking back control. We have, you know, a government that truly did everything it could over the coronavirus crisis, and yet more than 100,000 people are dead. You know, we had to have Captain Tom, a 100-year-old man who had to walk laps of his garden to raise money for the NHS in one of the richest countries in the world. You know, we've kind of gone through some sort of looking glass, and I think there's something really important to explore, which I hope we can do.
Britain through the looking glass. We always, to be honest, we never know what the news cycle is. And we have some hit stories this week, particularly procurement, meetings with Murdoch, and we'll no doubt have hit stories next week. What the newspaper does is kind of create a narrative and balances that out of what's happened in the month. So we urge you, obviously it's a huge plug for Byline Times. Why? Because it's Friday night with Byline Times. We're allowed to do this. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our guests, particularly Mike, and for coming in. And thank you, Hardy, for joining me. And we'll see you in Q&A in 10 minutes' time. You who can get into your wallets and take your credit cards out for a very small amount of money. But otherwise, we see the rest of you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.